Part 5, Chapter 4. For the 22 men who turned their faces inland, the excitement was past and the trial by patience had begun. Their helplessness was almost total, and they knew it. The Caird had sailed, taking with her the best of everything they had. After a while, they pulled the Wills farther up onto the beach, then turned her over and crawled underneath. As we sat there, cramped, crowded, and wet, wrote Macklin, we wondered how we were going to face the month ahead of us, which was the very least we could hope for before relief. And this, he admitted, was a most optimistic expectation, based upon a half-dozen assumptions, the first among them being that the Caird would actually get through. On this score, their general feeling, at least outwardly, was confident, but how else might they have felt? Any other attitude would have been the equivalent of admitting that they were doomed. No matter what the odds, a man does not pin his last hope for survival on something and then expect that it will fail. Supper was served early, and the men turned in almost immediately. They awoke the following morning to a bleak, forbidding day of half mist, half snow. The bad weather only made it more imperative that some sort of shelter be devised, so all hands returned to the work of excavating the ice cave in the face of the glacier. They kept at it all that day, and the next, and the next. But by the morning of the 28th, 4 days after the Caird had sailed, it was obvious that the idea would have to be abandoned. Whenever they were inside the cave, which was now large enough for several men to enter, the heat given off by their bodies would melt the interior so that streams of water ran down the walls and along the bottom. Only one possibility remained, the boats. Greenstreet and Marston suggested that they might be inverted to form the roof of a hut, and Wilde agreed. They began to collect rocks to build a foundation. It was exhausting toil. We are all ridiculously weak, Ordleys wrote. Stones that we could easily have lifted at other times we found quite beyond our capacity, and it needed 2 or 3 of us to carry some of that would otherwise have been one man's load. Our weakness is best compared with that which one experiences on getting up from a long illness. Unfortunately, most of the suitable stones lay at the seaward end of the spit, which meant they had to be carried nearly 150 yards to the site chosen for the shelter. Finally, when the foundation walls were about 4 feet high, the boats were placed on top, side by side. It took more than an hour to chalk up the wall a little here and lower it somewhere there. The few scraps of wood that remained were laid across the upended boats from keel to keel, and a tent was stretched over the whole affair. Its ropes were anchored at each side to serve as guys. As a final touch, pieces of canvas were lashed around the foundation so that the wind might not find its way in between the stones. There was a gap in the foundation on the shoreward side to serve as an entrance, and 2 overlapping blankets were hung there to keep the weather out. At last, Wilde pronounced the hut ready for occupancy, and the men gathered up their sodden sleeping bags and crawled inside. They were allowed to select whatever spot they wanted, and some men immediately crawled up into the upper story, formed by the inverted seats of the boats. Other men took positions on the ground, wherever it looked the snuggest, or the driest, or the warmest. Supper was issued at 4:45 p.m., and the men warily crawled into their bags the moment they had eaten. For the first several hours, they lay in dreamless, exhausted sleep, but shortly after midnight, a new blizzard blew up, and from then until dawn, their sleep was fitful at best. The gales screaming down from the peaks inland shook the hut, and it seemed that each new gust would knock the boats off their foundation. And the force of the wind penetrated every chink, so that snow whistled in through 1,000 tiny openings, but somehow when dawn came, the shelter was still intact. Then what a miserable getting up, wrote Macklin. Everything deeply snowed over, footgear frozen so stiff that he could only put it on by degrees, not a dry or warm pair of gloves amongst us. I think I spent this morning the most unhappy hour of my life. All attempts seemed so hopeless, and fate seemed absolutely determined to thwart us. Men sat and cursed, not loudly, but with an intenseness that showed their hatred of this island on which we had sought shelter. But if they were to survive, there was work to be done, in spite of the cold and the wind, which was sometimes so furious that they had to duck inside until the gusts eased off. They set about making the shelter more secure. Some men rearranged the tents over the roof and lashed down the guy ropes more solidly. Others tucked in bits of blankets around the foundation and packed wet grit from the beach against the whole affair to seal it up. But again, that night, the blizzard raged on. Snow once more found its way inside, though not nearly so much as the night before. On the morning of April 30th, James, Hudson, and Hurley, who had been trying to sleep in their tent, gave up and moved into the shelter with everybody else. Hurley wrote, "Life here without a hut and equipment is almost beyond endurance." But little by little, as the wind revealed their vulnerable spots, they sealed them up, and each day the shelter became just a little more livable. They tried cooking their meals inside, but after 2 days, Green succumbed to smoke blindness and had to be relieved temporarily by Hurley. They remedied the problem of smoke to a large degree by extending a chimney up through the roof between the two boats. But then some wild caprice of wind would frequently rush down the chimney, expelling a great, thick masses of smoke into the hut, and making the air inside so dense that the men would be forced into the open, half-choked, with tears running down their cheeks. During the day, enough light filtered through the canvas roofing so that the men could make their way about, but long before dusk, the hut grew much too dark to see anything. Marston and Hurley experimented and found that by filling a small container with blubber oil and draping pieces of surgical bandage over the edge as a wick, they could obtain a feeble flame by which a man might read if he were not more than a few feet away. By such methods, they gradually eliminated one little misery after another. At last, on May 2nd, 8 days after the Caird had sailed, and more than 2 weeks after their arrival, the sun came out. The men hurriedly carried their sleeping bags outside to spread them out to dry. It was clear again on the 3rd and on the 4th. Even after 3 days of sunshine, their sleeping bags were not completely dry, though the improvement was a notable one. "We are already much drier than we were ever expected to be again," James wrote. There were lengthy debates about how long it would take the Caird to reach South Georgia, and how long after that it would be before a rescue ship arrived. The most optimistic figured that by May 12th, a week hence, they might expect to see a ship. More conservative guesses said that it would be June 1st before there could be any thought of rescue. But again, it was a matter of fighting back hope. Even as early as May 8th, long before they could expect anything to have happened, all of them were already worrying about whether the ice conditions around the island might prevent a relief ship from approaching. This anxiety had a solid basis in fact. The month of May, the equivalent to November in the Northern Hemisphere, was already 1/4 over. I accidentally highlighted some text, and I was removing the highlight. There we go. Winter was only a matter of weeks, possibly days away. When it did arrive, there was a strong possibility that ice might form completely around the island and thwart any attempts to bring a ship in. On May 12th, Macklin wrote, "Wind from east. Expect we will get the pack into the bay again. We do not want this just now, with daily hope of the relief ship." There was plenty to keep them occupied, though they worked with one eye kept to seaward. There were penguins to be killed, and once in a while a seal, and there was ice to be gathered for water. They spent long hours trying to snare patties, small pigeon-like scavenger birds, which flitted around the pile of meat. An oar was made into a flagstaff and placed on the highest accessible point. From it, incongruously enough, the Royal Yacht Club Bergie stood out before the Elephant Island gales as a signal to the anticipated relief ship. Macklin and McElroy were kept busy with patients. Kerr developed a bad tooth, and Macklin had to pull it for him. "And a grimy quack of a dentist I must have looked," wrote Macklin. "Not much refinement here. Come outside and open your mouth. No cocaine or anesthesia." Wordy's hand became infected, and Holness was troubled with a sty. Rickinson was slowly recovering from the heart attack he suffered the day they landed, but the saltwater boils on his wrists stubbornly refused to heal. Greenstreet's feet, which had been frostbitten in the boats, did not improve, and he was confined to his sleeping bag. Hudson seemed in a serious way. His hands showed definite signs of healing, but the pain in his left buttock, which had begun in the boats, had developed into a very large abscess, which pained him constantly. Mentally, too, the scars of the boat journey apparently were still with him. Much of the time he lay in his sleeping bag for hours without speaking, and he seemed disinterested and detached from what was going on around him. The most serious invalid was Blackborough. His right foot appeared to be recovering, and there was hope that it might even be saved, but in the toes of his left foot, gangrene had already set in. McElroy, who was attending him, was chiefly concerned with preventing the afflicted parts from developing what is called wet gangrene, in which the dead flesh remains soft and is likely to spread infection to other parts of the body. In dry gangrene, the parts turn black and become brittle. In time, the body builds up a wall separating the living tissue from the dead, and the threat of infection is greatly reduced. McElroy was intent on seeing that Blackborough's foot remained dry so that the separation would be complete before any operation was undertaken. More and more, as the days wore on, they fell inescapably into the routine of their existence. Each evening before supper, they would take one final long look to seaward to make certain that the dark shape of a ship or a wisp of smoke on the horizon had not been overlooked. But when they had satisfied themselves that no relief vessel was to be seen, they would go into the hunt for supper. Afterward, Hussey would often play the banjo for a time, but the short period in the evening before the blubber lamps were extinguished was devoted mostly to talk. Almost anything could serve as a topic of conversation or debate, though their rescue was the primary subject, with food running a close second. Marston had a penny cookbook, and it was in constant demand. Each night he would loan it out to one group of men or another, and they would pore over it, planning the imaginary meals they would have when they got home. Ordley's wrote one night, "We want to be fed with a large wooden spoon, and like the Korean babies, be patted on the stomach with the back of the spoon so as to get in a little more than would otherwise be the case. In short, we want to be overfed, grossly overfed, yes, very grossly overfed, on nothing but porridge and sugar, black currant and apple pudding and cream, cake, milk, eggs, jam, honey, and bread and butter till we burst, and we'll shoot the man who offers us meat. We don't want to see or hear of any more meat as long as we live." On May 17th, McElroy conducted a poll of the hut, asking each man what he would have if he were permitted any one dish of his choice. The result revealed that Ordley's was right. The craving for sweets was almost unanimous, and the sweeter, the better. There were a few men, however, whose first choice went to something other than sweets, and Blackborough simply wanted some plain bread and butter. Green found himself the subject of much interest because he had once been employed as a pastry cook, and the men never seemed to tire of asking him about it, especially whether he had been permitted to eat all he wanted on the job. One night, Hurley, lying in his sleeping bag, heard Wilde and McElroy discussing food. "Do you like donuts?" Wilde asked. "Rather," McElroy replied. "Damned easily made too," Wilde said. "I like them cold with a little jam." "Not bad," said McElroy. "But how about a huge omelet?" "Bally fine." Later, two of the forecastle hands were overheard by Hurley discussing some extraordinary mixture of hash, applesauce, beer, and cheese. Then, Marston, referring to his cookbook, got into a heated debate with Green over whether breadcrumbs should form the base for all puddings. Through one means or another, they kept their spirits up, mostly by building dreams. But each day the ever-shortening hours of daylight told of the approach of winter. The sun now rose a little after 9 o'clock and set at about 3 p.m. Since they were more than 300 miles north of the Antarctic Circle, they did not have to face the prospect of the sun disappearing altogether. But the weather was becoming increasingly cold. Macklin wrote on May 22nd, "There is a big change in the scenery about here. Everything is now covered with snow, and there is a considerable ice foot to both sides of the spit. For the last few days, ice had been coming in, and dense pack extends in all directions, as far as the eye can reach, making the chances of a near rescue seem very remote. No ship but a properly constructed ice ship would be safe in this pack. An iron steamer would be smashed up very soon. Besides this, there is very little daylight now." Indeed, the realization was spreading that, logically at least, a rescue before winter was becoming increasingly improbable, if not impossible. On May 25th, 1 month and 1 day after the Carrot had sailed, Hurley wrote, "Weather drifting snow and wind from east. Our wintry environment embodies the most inhospitable and desolate prospect imaginable. All are resigned now and fully anticipate wintering.